Hey everyone, I just wanted to go through a little bit of the summary of what you cover in chapter 5. So this section really starts our look into different types of research methods, how do we study problems, and we'll expose you to lots of different ways to go about doing research. So the first one we're going to tackle is the systematic review. And so some of you may be familiar with systematic reviews. You may have looked systematic reviews in some of the work that you had done related to clinical findings and what's the best evidence related to clinical topics. And so you may be familiar with systematic reviews, and you may have read some systematic reviews. So what we're going to talk about is the types of systematic reviews. We're going to talk about how you would set up a systematic review and the steps that are used. Talk about how we search databases and how the searching piece happens in a systematic review, and talk about grade literature. So you don't have to memorize how to do a systematic review. There's some very clear guidelines that are published. But I think what I want you to get out of this really is an appreciation for the rigor that goes into a systematic review. So a systematic review is a method to gather, analyze, and synthesize studies in order to answer a research question. And there are very specific methods that you go about doing this. It isn't just like, oh, I did a search in PubMed and I'm going to take all these articles and on the same topic and sort of synthesize them all together. There is a very specific method you would go about to do this. It's used in healthcare a lot, so systematic reviews often are considered a very high level of evidence, and a lot of times once there are strong systematic reviews for a particular procedure or particular treatment, it may become the standard of care. So the role that systematic reviews play in evidence-based practice and in research they do is really, it's a way to combine multiple studies on the same topic for a more comprehensive review of what are the outcomes. It also can identify gaps in the research and helps you sort of organize the evidence in order to make decisions about your practice. These are good ways to really get a good hold on what is a lot of the literature about one particular topic. There are lots of different organizations that regularly have systematic reviews being developed. One that you're probably most familiar with is the Cochrane collaboration. And so you've probably read some of the Cochrane reviews or you've accessed those. That's a really popular one, particularly in dental literature and a lot of healthcare literature. But there are also other organizations that work on developing systematic reviews for particular topics. So when we say systematic reviews, there's actually lots of different ways and types that this can be. So some of these are just a general systematic review. Some are a meta-analysis, and a meta-analysis would include analyzing the data from each of these, not just sort of a review of outcomes. There's scoping or mapping reviews, there's integrative reviews, qualitative reviews, realist reviews, and a review of reviews. And so there's lots of different ways to reviews. We're going to focus mostly on the general systematic review, talk a little bit about a meta-analysis review, but just know that there's lots of different ways to do systematic reviews. So we're going to talk next about the steps. You don't have to memorize these. You're not going to have to do a systematic review in this course, but I think it's good to understand and to appreciate all the steps that go into doing this. So really, you start with a research question. Just like in any other topic, you start with a research question. And what is it that we're looking to review and answer the question for? So if you were looking to see something particular about a clinical question, does SDF, how long does SDF arrest carries or something like that? And so really like detailing what it is you're asking is the first step. The next step you may want to become more specific. So you may use the PICO framework, which you may be familiar with. You may look at, is there a certain population we want to study then? So maybe we're only interested in studying this in children. Maybe the intervention is SDF, the comparison maybe is fluoride varnish, and the outcome is reoccurrence of caries. And so you may want to get very specific in your criteria. And so you can use the PICO framework in order to do that. So this is an example of basically sort of the PICO question. If you were looking at children, so the question is, do the published studies show that reducing screen time reduces or prevents obesity in children? So the population is children. The intervention would be reducing screen time. The comparison is doing nothing, keeping things the way they are. And the outcome is reducing weight or body mass index. And so when you're looking at, if this is sort of what you're studying, then the criteria that you're looking for, participants would need to be children within a certain age. You would look at randomized control trials, possibly only looking at those. The outcome would have to be reported in weight or BMI. If you can only read English, then the limitation would be you can only read studies published in English. And then you may want to put a time frame on it. So how far back are we going to look at studies? Maybe it's 1990, maybe it's something soon, maybe it's 2000, maybe it's 2010. So making sure you sort of break down what are the criteria that you're looking for. And then the methods, are appropriate for what you're studying. So what you want to do too is look at other reviews. Are there other reviews on this topic? What are the quality of those reviews? Has this already been done? And if it's already been done, then maybe it's not something that you need to contribute, or maybe you need to change your study or the topic a little bit, but you want to make sure that, there isn't a strong systematic review already out there about this topic. If it's not current, if it's something that was done several years ago, there may be additional evidence that you could put into a systematic review. So really, then you're going to sort of make a final definition of the purpose. So what is the objective? What kind of scope are we only children? Are we talking about, only weight and BMI? Are we talking about recurrent caries? Sort of what are we looking for? And then what are the standards that we're setting for the studies that we're looking for? Generally, systematic reviews are done in a team, and there's usually a timeline, and you can also choose a software to work within in order to assist in doing a systematic review. These are some different types of softwares that you can use in the review process, and so this can help to keep everything organized and to help keep your team on track and on the same page. So the only one that I'm super familiar with is In Vivo. I do use that for some other purposes, but these are all different tools that if you were doing a systematic review that you could use. And so really you're going to start this, looking to do a search. And so you're going to look to really what you want to do is locate all of the relevant articles that meet your criteria. You want to minimize the bias that you have in your review and minimize the number of irrelevant articles that come up. So in a systematic review, when you create a search, so if you're searching for children, screen time, and obesity, you are going to develop the search. Then you're going to evaluate the search. So did I get the right outcomes that I wanted? Is this the right terms I should be using? And you may have to go back and change after you evaluate the search. And then once you have your sort of final search terms, you want to save and document that search. So you can save that through the database. You can save it by documenting the exact terms that you used and those types of things. But generally, saving it through the database is an important step. And then you may want to then translate that and look in other databases. So if you searched in PubMed first, maybe you also search in CINAHL and you search in some other health sciences databases to use those search terms in those, so you have all the relevant literature. You're going to list the databases you want to search, make sure the inclusion criteria. So if you're only looking at studies since the year 2000, make sure you include that, and then decide on the most important databases that would have your topic. You want to save the search within, so if you're searching in PubMed, you can actually save the search within that platform. So you create a login and you save it. And then you can also copy and store the exact search in another location. So you could, put the terms, exactly what you found, the exact search, save it somewhere else within your work so it can be referenced. Other things you might want to record is, so your database, what you're using, what date you searched, what the years and limits. So if I only search from 2000 to the current or 2015 to the current, what other limits? So maybe articles only published in English, and then how many articles did it produce? And then any new articles that you would add at a later time. The next step in appraisal really involves narrowing down the articles to the studies that you will analyze. So you've done this systematic search, you have a lot of articles, and you really want to decide which ones you're going to analyze and become part of your systematic review. So you'll want to look at the articles, looking at the full text, looking at the methods they used, sort of looking at each of these articles and decide on, screening these articles. Who's going to screen them? Are there people who are going to, so they're going to check, is this a randomized control trial? Is BMI and weight and outcome? And so sort of like a checklist of, does this meet our criteria? And you may have within your team different people doing different parts of this. So when you are evaluating screening, you are going to look at which articles did people suggest including? What articles would you suggest excluding? And you want to make sure that each author is applying the criteria the same. And so you may have screening between authors, you may do a check between authors. And so you basically want to decide if all of these citations would be included, excluded, and when they were sort of excluded from your systematic review. So you've got a big list of lots of citations, and between you and your team, you have to decide whether you're going to include them or exclude them. A checklist is an easy way to do that. Sort of the design is what type of sampling was used. Did they use the outcome measures you're looking for? How valid and reliable were the results, and were there significance of the results? And then you would basically look at everyone's appraisal for each article, and then you would resolve any disagreements. So sometimes disagreements are resolved that, like, if two of your team members say, oh, I think we should include it because of this, and someone else says, no, I think we shouldn't include it because of this, there could be a third person who makes the final decision, or you come to a consensus amongst the team on how you would decide to include it or exclude it. And you really want to talk about what it's important, like what's the procedure for disagreements on that. The next part is you really want to expand your search techniques. So you've done your literature, you've done your reviews within the database, you've looked at all the literature, and so you also want to minimize publication bias. So publication bias is that all articles that are submitted to journals aren't published, right? So oftentimes we only see articles that are published that find significant differences or have significant findings. If you ran a study and realized there's no difference between varnish and SDF, it may not get published. And so there is a bias in publication. And so, so some of the ways that in a systematic review that you would combat that publication bias is to look through not only the references section of each of your studies, but also into the great literature. And so when you you will look at all the articles screened, you will look at the references in these articles, and retrieve all the citations that may be relevant. And then you would put those through the same process of the ones you found in the database. So this may add additional studies to your analysis. The gray literature is, publications that are either not published or they might not be published within, different types of publishing journals. Some of these are government reports. Some of these are like early prints of things, so things that are coming out in the literature but are only in draft version, or just like a preprint version. There could be white papers that don't come up in databases. Papers and presentations may not come up. Technical reports, dissertations, and theses a lot of times will not show up in a database unless you're specifically looking for those. Lots of different areas where you could find literature that just isn't published necessarily in, databases, in the journals that are in the databases. And so it's, important to look at that gray literature. The next step, once you have all of the studies that you're going to include, is to synthesize the studies. And so you're going to code the data or the characteristics from each study and combine the information in appropriate ways. So you may be looking at, some studies said that, yes, reducing TV did decrease BMI, and some maybe said that they did not. Some may have used BMI as an outcome. Some may have used just overall weight as an outcome. And so you would have a form that you would complete for each study and basically collect all the data that you needed to answer your research question. So depending on what your research question is, the information you want to collect. And then you would look at who is the study population, the design, the details of the intervention, and what outcomes were being measured. Once you have all this information, you can sort of synthesize these results. So a narrative synthesis basically would combine the results from different types of research. So this group of studies says, yes, that reducing TV time decreases BMI in children. This group of studies says no. And maybe some other different outcomes, and you would, combine sort of those results in narrative synthesis. A framework synthesis basically compares the results with a pre-selected framework, which we don't have to really go into that. And then if there are sort of qualitative things, you can do a thematic synthesis. If you're doing a meta-analysis, you would actually be looking at the statistical procedures and the data in order to basically decide and sort of aggregate that all together. So everyone would need to be using the same method of measurement. So we couldn't have some studies measuring in one way and some studies measuring in another way. You would need all the studies that are measuring in one particular way. And so you would take this data and aggregate, and generally results are presented in a forest plot. That's just, you don't have to memorize that or know exactly what that is yet. We'll talk a little bit more about those things in the stats course. And then you write. So you're going to analyze the strength of evidence, generalizability. You're going to determine the limitations, provide recommendations, and then write your systematic review. In assessing your limitations, you want to think about what are the gaps in the literature. Are there areas that weren't studied? Are there only studies? Are there no randomized control trials? Are there, you have to sort of evaluate the studies also. So are these studies reliable? Are there quality issues in some of the studies? How have you assessed sort of the whole package of the literature on a certain topic? You would then list recommendations for action. So what can someone take from this? Are there, is there strong evidence concluding something in particular? Are there recommendations of further research that needs to be done? And so, sort of what are those types of things? You would register the protocol, write the report. This Prisma checklist is something you may want to be familiar with if you're ever reading these or looking at these. Basically, it provides sort of a framework and a quality check on some of these things, but this is a good reference to look at if you're doing a systematic review. And then, you know, you're going to write your paper. This is you know, a flow chart basically, which kind of helps to talk about each step. So let's say you start with, you record, you know, you do your database search and you find 2,000 articles. And then you find some additional 500 articles. And so you've got total of 2,500 different articles. The next step is you would remove any duplicates. So that was 700. So some databases will give you the same results. And so you would take out the duplicates. And so you would take away 700 of those. You would screen the abstracts. And so you would then look at those and say, okay, so we're going to, out of the 1,000, we excluded 900. And the reason we excluded them, 300 were not about children, 200 were not a primary study, and 400 were not about screen time. So that leaves you with 100 records, okay? And so then you're going to look at the full text of these records. And out of the 100, you excluded 60 because 40 did not include an outcome measure and 20 were of poor quality. All right, so you end up with 40 studies. You started with 2,500, right? And you've ended up with 40 by applying some of these methods in order to study. So this is just one way to sort of show you in a flowchart version of how you would get to your set of articles that you would, manuscripts that you would be looking at. So that's the basics of systematic reviews. Again, I don't expect you to memorize all the steps. You would use resources to guide you through doing a systematic review. Systematic reviews are really big projects. They are really, you know, very rigorous and take a lot of time, but they are an important part of the literature that we have. And so it's important for you to appreciate sort of what systematic reviews are and how to do them and what they mean, especially when you're looking at the literature related to systematic reviews. So I hope this gives you a little bit of clarification on some of the chapter this week.